Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of both the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians managed to advance in the eastern parts of Mariupol as well as in the southern flank of Menrad, the northern flank of the city, within the eastern parts of Siversk and to the north of Liman. The Ukrainians in turn managed to recapture some positions in the western parts of Kupiansk, within Novopavlivka, and in the eastern parts of Malatokmashka. Starting out in the south, the Ukrainians managed to recapture the central parts of the town and push towards the prison area where the Russian forces are holding their main forces. Russian forces are mainly positioned on the eastern parts of the town, as well as the prison area, where the main force is within the prison area because it provides cover from Ukrainian FPV drones and artillery, which means that the Russian forces staying there, the only way for the Ukrainians to clear them is by storming them or pushing them away from it. While the residential area is much more vulnerable as artillery can strike their positions there, the Ukrainians are here working on clearing the residential buildings to push the Russians out towards the southern parts near the prison area and cut off the main supply line, which is the eastern highway. There is still the southern forest line leading up to the prison area, and drones that can supply the Russian forces. However, if the Ukrainians are able to recapture the eastern parts of the town, they'll be able to significantly limit the supplies and put pressure on the Russian forces in the area. To the northeast of this, the Russians continue their offensive operations in the direction of Mariupol, gaining control over some of the eastern roads in the northeastern parts of the town. The Russians are here working from the fortifications on the eastern flank into the residential area, from the farm area in the north, and through the main road in the northeastern direction. Russians are here combining their forces through the residential buildings, but mainly advancing with the use of infantry and drones, clearing the buildings from Ukrainian forces and pushing through. The fortifications on the northern flank is being contested by the Russian forces as they're pushing through to capture these fortifications, clearing the way for the northern flanks. And I really like the Zaporizhia region for the fortifications because they give a clear overview of how all of these fortifications work together to form defensive lines. However, we do not get the full impression of it. That is why the movie from 2 days ago, and also referenced yesterday, and will now be referenced for the third day in a row, is interesting because we see footage from these different battles. I'll start out with the first image here, which is an image of a trench and a Ukrainian soldier within that trench. The trenches in this war is very significant because it provides a significant and steady line where infantry can operate within. They are mostly safe from artillery because artillery is not accurate enough to land within these trenches, and even if they do, most of the shrapnel will not hit the infantry. So artillery is largely useless when facing against trenches. What is mostly useful in trenches is drones. Because the example of this soldier, a drone can find him and strike him. It can drop grenades, it can strike him directly with an FPV drone. This means generally the soldiers within trenches are mostly vulnerable to these drones. The second type of fortification is a foxhole. This is what we see in this image here, where the soldier perspective is within this foxhole. It is a small hole that is circular, similar to a trench, but more open from the top. These are more vulnerable to artillery and are only used near frontline positions where the purpose is simply to provide cover for a firefight during the firefight. So this sort of hole is not useful at all against long-range strikes. It's only used for short-range combat. These are usually ahead of the trench systems. So if we take a look at the current trench system here, we can see that there are several trenches which are well prepared. These are superior to the foxholes, so well prepared lines simply do not have a lot of foxholes. But if we take a closer look at the fortifications near the road, they are closer to what a foxhole is. And these are positions that are simply manned when Russian soldiers are detected. They go to these frontline positions. The Ukrainian forces who were operating on the outskirts of the city would be moving from these trenches to these forward positions where they will be acting and shooting from. But besides that, they'll be withdrawing to these trenches where they are safer. But again, neither of these are safe from drones. Now, the third fortification type is a dirt bunker, as I call it. And these are dugouts within these trench systems that go under the ground. These are safe from artillery, drones, and pretty much everything except for infantry nearing into these areas. Previously, they would have the entrance open. This means drones could simply fly in, but now they have doors and other protective things that prevent drones from flying in and attacking the forces within it. Instead, the only way to clear these dugouts is by going over and throwing down grenades into these bunkers, or as in the footage where they are asking the soldiers within it to surrender because they have everything covered. They can throw in grenades and kill them, but instead they choose to get some prisoners for future prisoner exchanges. Now, defensive lines such as the first and second line of defense within the Zaporizhia region have much more concrete bunkers, which are prepared bunkers that are made out of concrete, which survive a lot more artillery and heavy strikes. While these dirt dugouts can fall in and crumble on itself, the concrete bunkers can sustain a lot more damage. Now, the way to clear them is the same, where the Russians go closer to these bunkers, throwing grenades or ask them to surrender. They barely ever go into close range combat. These are mostly for special forces or reconnaissance groups that go behind enemy lines and go into it. They typically clear with silencers and in a silent manner. Grenades and other weapons are much louder. They will likely be supported by drones, which can clear most of the trenches and foxholes. Speaking of how useful these drones are, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Syrsky recently spoke in an interview with Sky News. He stated that Russia has deployed more than 710,000 troops on the front line. He also mentions how the Russians and the Ukrainians typically launch from 4,000 to 5,000 kamikaze drones, the FPV drones, every single day, and about 1,500 to 2,000 drones dropping ammunition, whether it is mortar shells, grenades, and whatnot. So about 5,500 to 7,000 drones every single day used by both the Russians and the Ukrainians. However, what is interesting is that the casualties taken by drones has actually dropped from 70% to 60% in more recent times. That is because both sides are improving the countermeasures against drones. To the northeast of this, in the direction of Novopavlivka, the Ukrainians recaptured the northern and eastern parts of the town, regaining control over much of it, pushing the Russians back to the central parts and southern parts. This is likely due to the fact that the road from Novopavlivka and down south is a very far distance, which makes it difficult for the Russians to properly resupply the forces within it. The Ukrainians have sent reinforcements and have a better logistics in the area, as they have several settlements such as Biliivka, Tuhoyeve, and Fedorivske, from where drone operators are operating. The Ukrainians also have better logistics in the area with the railway connection to Meshova and in the direction of Pokrovsk. The Russians are diverting a lot of their supplies to the Pokrovsk direction, and the Donetsk city is currently supplying several frontline positions and a large amount of forces, while the Ukrainians are able to redirect their forces to several concentrated areas. We're also seeing an increase in Ukrainian counterattacks, especially at the start of this month, at the end of the last month, both in the direction of Kupiansk in the north and the general area around the Zaporizhia section of the front line, where the Ukrainians are aiming to stop the Russian momentum. The Russians are having a difficulty consolidating the positions within Novopavlivka, and the Ukrainians have been able to counterattack and regain some positions in the western and northern parts of the town. To the northeast of this, the Russians continue offensive operations to the south of Milnerad, gaining control over the waste heap to the southeast. This allows the Russians to improve their positions along the eastern flank and the supply lines leading up to Milnerad, and will strengthen the Russian offensive capabilities in the southern parts of the city through the central parts and up towards the northern parts. The Russians are close to gaining full control over the apartment complex area in the eastern parts of the city. This will allow them to connect their forces between the south and the east and continue offensive operations towards the central parts of the northern section of the city, where the siege of the city continues, where the Russians are attacking from the northwestern, southwestern, southeastern, and eastern directions as the main directions, and with the renewed offensive operations from the west as well. The Russians are putting pressure everywhere around Milnerad. As for the northern flank, the Russians managed to gain control over the last portion of Ukrainian positions here to the east of the defensive line, except for Soretsk in the south, where the Russians continued offensive operations to consolidate their positions along the eastern flank of the defensive line and the northern flank of Rodinsk to resupply their forces within the Rodinsk direction, connecting to the supplies near Novokondomishne. And with the renewed offensive from the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians are putting pressure on Hryshine and the Ukrainian positions within Rodinsk. To the northeast of this, the Russians continue offensive operations within Siversk, gaining control over the apartment complex buildings in the eastern flank of Siversk. With the capture of these apartment complex buildings, all of the positions of the Ukrainians overlooking the eastern flank of the city have now been captured by the Russians. As they continue pushing and pressuring the Ukrainian positions within the apartment complex area in the central parts of the eastern section of the town, the Russians are slowly pushing through to gain full control over Siversk, where the main areas being contested is the eastern apartment complex area, northern residential area, and the railway station, while the western parts remain firmly under Ukrainian controls as long as they have control over the fortifications on the western flank. To the northwest of this, the Russians continue offensive operations towards Dobyshev, where they are pushing through the northeastern fortifications and defensive line to gain control over the northern flank and consolidate their positions in the northern, western, and eastern directions to gain control over Dobyshev and push through the supply lines, resupplying the Ukrainian positions within Liman and the area surrounding the city. The Russians continue offensive operations to clear up the fortifications and defensive lines on the northern flank of Liman to cut off the final land-based supply line towards Liman, where there is some river crossings to the south that the Ukrainians can still rely on. The main roads are almost entirely cut off. Finally, in the northern section of the front line, the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks within the town of Kupiansk, where they managed to regain control over several positions along the western flank of it, gaining control over additional residential areas and the residential section of it, pushing up towards the apartment complex area in the southern part of it and towards the railway station in the central parts. The Ukrainians here are entering from one of the weakest flanks of Kupiansk and are now putting pressure on the strongest positions the Russians have. The Ukrainian objective here is to cut off the supplies leading to these fortified areas in the southern parts of the city to siege the Russian positions, while further north, the Ukrainians have also been attempting to regain control of the supply lines leading into the city from the northern flank, and the Ukrainians also attempting to counterattack on the eastern parts of the Uskerevo line. The Russians are here attempting to achieve a lot with really unstable supply lines, which means that the Russian positions within the city are unstable as well, while the Ukrainians have much better fortifications and supply lines leading to the southern and western parts of it. The Ukrainians here have the advantage when it comes to logistics and supplies, and this puts a lot of pressure on the Russians, but the Russians do have control of the majority of the city, which gives them an advantage in the defensive capabilities. So we'll have to see whether the Russians are able to consolidate their eastern positions or the Ukrainians are able to recapture the city first. But as it stands, the Russians have control over all of the major defensive positions within Kupiansk, but the Ukrainians have re-entered the city and are putting a lot of pressure on the Russians from the south, west, and north of the city. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.